everyone, Alexa Donne here, and today I am going to be talking about things that I do not particularly like in books. I did a companion video of sorts to this. I did the positive side, which is things I love in books, which I will link to down below, but I know you're here for the juicy juice, and that is, what do I hate? It's really not hate though. This is more like things that I just don't vibe with. Some of it's tropes, some of it's kind of set up concept stuff that if I see it in a book, I'm either gonna take a miss on it. It's just kind of like sometimes I'm just apathetic, and it might mean that it doesn't rise to the top of my TBR. And in some cases, when these things are in books and I'm not expecting them, or they don't properly subvert my lower expectations, they can contribute to me just really not quite liking a book. I know it's silly to use disclaimers, but when you go negative, it makes you feel better, and this is not a knock on anyone's personal preferences. I actually guarantee that you like some of these things that I don't quite like. That is totally cool. My not liking things is not a reflection on you or your taste or what you write or anything. It's just totally down to personal reader preference. Let's dive right in. I've got 13 of these. Lucky, unlucky number 13. And the first one is really don't vibe with quests, adventure novels, adventure fiction. Like, when that is the crux of a plot thing, I just don't get enthusiastic about it. This is one that I'm kind of apathetic toward. So things where it's like we must band together and go on a quest to find thing is generally less interesting to me, and this actually comes up and works against me a lot in sci-fi, like space stories, because so many of them are like quest and journey based, and I'm just a little less interested in those kinds of plots. The second thing I'm just not into, though it kind of has an asterisk, is magical creatures. I like some, and then there's a whole bunch I'm just really not into. And this is a case of it's gonna be an auto no for me on a ton of these, or at least such a strong barrier to entry that an author has to hit it out of the park to get me into these magical creatures. So examples that I'm just not into include fae, elves, trolls, goblins, mermaids, like any of that kind of like sea folk kind of thing. Creature from the Black Lagoon is not for me. Shapeshifters, kind of going into angels and demons, which I know isn't quite magical creatures, except they kind of are. It's basically a ton of the trappings of paranormal fiction, though they also come up in urban fantasy and some fantasy stories. I just am not super into all of the creatures. It's really creature fiction, but under this like kind of umbrella, I like vampires and werewolves. And so it really depends on the lore and kind of what goes into them. And fae is actually kind of my middle ground here. Sometimes I really like fae books, like I loved The Cruel Prince, but very often I see fae concepts and they just don't interest me. The third thing is really weirdly specific and something I discovered I didn't like in the last year, and it's just a matter of me kind of changing as a person and one of my personal anxieties, but it's a legit thing that might speak to some of you, and that is any kind of calorie counting or food tracking in a book. The irony is that my favorite book when I was 17 was Bridget Jones's Diary, a series I loved that was really instrumental for me, and I don't know if I could read it now, because I've just had a personal journey with my own kind of food anxieties and stuff where I get really anxious reading any character counting calories or tracking their food obsessively. It sends me into kind of eating disorder or disordered eating territory, and I also just don't like seeing characters do it because I worry about them even though they're fictional. And I did see a YA book that did this recently, and I had to literally skim my eyes over those sections. I found I couldn't read them. So if I were to see a book structured around that, it would be a definite miss for me now. The fifth one is a big like stew pot of things that are all kind of related, and it's casual misogyny, unexamined or unsubverted, unaware rape culture, stalkers, abusive romantic interests, kind of that whole like bubbling stew of normalizing misogyny and abusive romantic relationships, that kind of stuff. So this is when in a book I see a a romantic pairing where we're meant to be rooting for a couple where he's being abusive and she's being gaslit, all that kind of stuff. It doesn't come up that often or as often as it used to be. It was always something I didn't love in books, especially in YA, and you see less of it now, but it creeps in sometimes. I read an adult thriller last year that really normalized a jealous, abusive romantic relationship, and I couldn't get behind it. And in the deep past, like, honestly, this is why I could never get into certain YA books that were popular a really long time ago. It definitely feels like it was a trend in YA, the bad boy trend where the bad boy is actually abusive. And it's really just not for me. I think in large part because in real life, I'm gonna go, I'd rather be single, bye. So I just don't really want to read that in a book. If it's like a character who does it and she does kick him to the curb, that's okay. But I don't want it idealized as the main romantic relationship, anything that kind of normalizes abuse. And actually, I do have another really good example where the book did subvert it and ultimately I was okay with it, but I was really uncomfortable with my reading experience, and that was A Stranger on the Beach, which I read last year by Michelle Campbell. If you watch my reading vlogs and wrap up of that, I basically had to hate read it, meaning I had to force myself through large bits of the text because I was so uncomfortable reading a character who was being obsessive and jealous and stalkery, but then the book subverted it and I was ultimately okay with it, but it still was really hard to read. So the fifth thing that just really bugs me in books is narrative cheats. This is when the author basically does something sneaky that kind of defies logic and reasoning, defies the book's own logic, or just kind of like messes with the reader, like, this was here all along, but I chose not to reveal it to you. You have to be really, really careful doing those kinds of things where the reader doesn't feel cheated. And I don't like when authors do that. The best example I have of that was a Shari LaPena book I read years ago. It was multi-POV, and the crux of the entire suspense thriller, like the what happened, like blowing the case wide open, was a character who was there the whole time, and the author withheld her POV, and it felt cheap to me. So it's that kind of thing that I don't really like. And related to that, the sixth thing I don't like is unearned twists, endings, and kind of villain reveals. I don't like it when a thriller, this is really a thriller thing, usually when it's building up to something, building up to something, building up to something, and then the thing happens and you're like, no. It's endings and twists that just feel a little too convenient, that haven't been properly foreshadowed, or just kind of executed in a way that kind of robs the story of tension, excitement, payoff. And a really good example of this for me personally was The Lion Game by Ruth Ware, an author generally I love, who's a 5-star author for me, but that particular book I felt really bungled the twist, didn't earn its twist, and it's literally told to the reader via dialogue and internal monologue in a scene where a bunch of characters are just sitting in a diner talking about the thing, and you as the reader are never given the opportunity to sit dramatically, narratively, in like a showy way versus telling in anything that led up to it. So you just get this scene where it's like, this is what was going on all along. I don't like that. That's almost also a narrative cheat. So I just don't like it when the ending isn't earned. On my things I love in books list, I had that I love sociopaths and abnormal psychology. And this can fall into things I don't love when that's done poorly, when you're just like, surprise, sociopath, and you're like, where? What? And nothing that came before in the book kind of lines up with the twist / reveal. Really bugs me. It can ruin a book for me, basically. So the seventh thing that I really don't like in books, this is kind of a expectations versus what a book is kind of thing. It could come down to marketing, which sometimes isn't the author's fault, but it can also be an author misleading the reader. And this is just a personal preference where if I go into a book and I'm told it is a romance, that I'm told it's a juicy romance, UST, so unresolved sexual tension, a slow burn, I expect there to be a big romance payoff in that book. It's the moment where the reader gets what they want, and I've definitely read books that advertise themselves as romance. This has happened in YA, where it's like, it's a great star-crossed lovers book, and then it's not. And that's really disappointing for me, and it can totally changed the way that I feel about a book. If I'd gone into the book knowing, oh, it's kind of low-key romance, there's not a lot of romance, the point of the book isn't the romance, because I also like books that don't have romance, and that's almost my preference in thrillers, for example. But if I go in expecting a certain kind of romance and then the book really peters out on it, that's going to be a disappointment for me. I don't like that. I think that an author needs to understand what romance is and what romance readers want, and don't give me false expectations if you're really not going to bring it home with the romance. This really is something I've seen way mostly, where it's either the author or the publisher being like, it's a romance, and then it's not. And I don't like that. So the 8th thing, I mean, I don't like this, and I feel like no one should like this, but it's very prevalent in literature, including award-winning literature. So I'm just gonna throw it out there. Really not a fan of disabled people being used as a plot device / inspiration porn for everyone else. This is the crux and or plot of a lot of books, and I'm just never going to pick them up personally. They also kind of cross-pollinate with sicklit, which is another thing that I've never been into. Sicklit has never really appealed to me. Going into a book knowing that people are going to be sick, dying, and probably someone dies at the end is generally not something I've gravitated toward, which means I haven't read a ton of the super famous YA sicklit books, but very often there's also this disability kind of crutch trope of like, she's so inspirational, she died for everyone, or I'm the hero of the novel because I was nice to the disabled person. And this, I've never really liked that, but it's also strongly influenced by the fact that I have disabled people in my life and I know how it makes them feel. So I've gone from like not gravitating towards those books in the first place to actively disliking them. So yeah, that's just something that's a real miss for me when I see it in the premise, including books where a character becomes disabled and is magically cured. If that is the plot of your book, I'm probably not going to be into it. So the 9th thing I don't really like in books, this is also a popular one, plenty of people don't like this either, so I'm not alone, and that is the I'm not like other girls, contrasted with the super evil, completely unnuanced bitch girl. It's always the contrast between the main character who's not like other girls. She's a cool girl or a nice girl, and just the unrepentant bitch who doesn't get to have any nuance. I mean, ultimately, neither of them really have any nuance. And I like my characters like I like my humans, a lot more complex than that. And I think that they're really damaging ideas of people, but specifically tropes about women, the Madonna versus whore kind of dichotomy. I'm just really not into it. If I'm gonna have a girl who's quirky or weird, yeah, she's not like other girls, but it's not like a weapon that she wields against them like, I'm cooler than you all suck, I'm a hipster girl. And I definitely tried to avoid the just like total black and white evil girl character, especially as an antagonist. I have them in my books because I like exploring complex relationships between women, which are a thing, and I like to read about those as well. But there just has to be some nuance in there and real character development to both sides. The 10th thing that really bugs me in books, this is just like a pet peeve, I don't like it when you read a YA book and the teens sound and feel like adults. They basically are 25 or 35, and no real effort is made to make them sound like a real teenager and ground them in what it actually means to be a teen. I guess this boils down to some people aren't as good at writing teenagers and other people are better at it. But when I pick up a book, especially, some of them are popular, and I'm just like, I'm reading a 25-year-old on the page. This isn't really a teenager. It kind of takes me out of it. There are real pros and cons to writing a properly voicey teenager, but generally if you gravitate toward YA, you want the pros part of it, or you don't mind the cons. So it's just a thing I don't like when a writer just really loses track of what an actual teen sounds and feels like. The 11th thing I'm just not into in books, this kind of informs my reading tastes with thrillers specifically, because this is a specific thing. I'm just not the reader for most, not all, but most like military thriller, FBI thriller, CIA thriller, like thrillers where the character is an investigator type. Like that's their job, and you kind of get into the nitty-gritty of the military world or the law enforcement world. 9 times out of 10, I'm not gonna gravitate toward that premise. There are exceptions, at least on like the FBI, CIA, law enforcement side, but it's pretty rare. There has to be a strong high concept, otherwise you gotta kind of slide me into those books. But I definitely don't gravitate toward military thrillers at all. It's just like a personal preference thing. I tend to like the layman character, or the person who has some knowledge and expertise but isn't that character. So like, I'll read a journalist main character in a thriller, the kind of former law enforcement or rookie law enforcement I think is a little bit different than experienced law enforcement. Or if it's a law enforcement officer, there's something else to the concept that is gonna like get me interested in the procedural nature of that POV. So the 12th thing I just don't like in books, I hinted at in my loves video. I mentioned that I really love hyper-specific hobbies and niche interests where I can get like deeply ingrained in an interesting and specific world, and I said that there was one major exception to that. This is that exception. I don't know why I cannot 9 times out of 10 get it into books about music or the music world, where the character is a musician or a songwriter or really into a specific musician, like going to concerts. It's just usually a miss for me. I find that I'm not interested in it most of the time. This is partly because I think so often with music is so subjective and like what we like. And plus when you're reading a book, you can't hear the music. So if I'm not familiar with the music, it's even less fun. But also I find a lot of authors enforce their own hipster music tastes into books like these, and they feel a little twee and pretentious. I think that's what really turns me off. And it does vary. I personally am interested in musical theater and classical music, so books that really go deep into that world could be interesting to me. But honestly, I cannot tell you the last time I read a book that was set in an immersive music-themed or music-inspired world. They're gonna go to the bottom of the TBR if I pick them up at all. Just a personal preference. And last, but certainly not least, lucky number 13 kind of ties to the first one. I just cannot get into ragtag teams who solve problems, go on quests, do heists. It's just not my preference. These are not nevers, they do slip to the bottom of the TBR if I pick them up at all, which does suck in like the sci-fi space realm because I recognize that most, certainly YA sci-fi space books are comp to Firefly, a thing I don't care about and I'm not into at all. Yes, I've seen it because I was a Buffy diehard, so of course I watched Joss's new thing, but the only parts of Firefly I liked were the virus plot, so I liked the movie Serenity, and the cannibals. I liked nothing else about it. And so many things that comp it and do the ragtag team and do like the heist, the quest, the like quirky cast of characters and like they're doing the thing just doesn't particularly interest me as a main propulsive plot. So I'm just very unlikely to pick up those books in the first place. Never say never. Of course I have read those kinds of books. It's just a very steep uphill climb for me as a reader, I just don't gravitate toward them. The thing about the dislikes list is you're always like justifying your reasons because you feel bad because people get very defensive when you don't like the thing that they love. I know why people love these things. They just don't personally pull me in as much. So really that is it. Those are 13 things that just don't do it for me in books. It's apathy most of the time that I'm just kind of meh about them. A few I actively dislike. Would I say hate? Some of these border on hate, but we're gonna go with strong dislike or just incredible apathy. Let me know down below in the comments. I mean, this is a fun one. What do you dislike in books? What is an auto reject for you, or a thing that will always make you dock a star or 2 from a book if it has it? Let's talk about the things we don't like in books. Give this video a thumbs up if you like it. I will make more bookish content. I post bookish videos 2 to 3 times a month, and I post videos 2 to 3 times a week if you want to subscribe. If you do, be sure to hit that notification bell so you know when I post a new video. As always, guys, thank you so much for watching, and happy reading. Let's read things we love. Positivity.